I think we start now, Ashish.
Okay.
Over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Good morning, Pam. I'm sure everybody can hear us. And as everybody knows, Pamela Rasmussen, Dr. Pamela Rasmussen needs no introduction to Indian bird watchers, especially with her book, Birds of South Asia. I'm sure everybody has a copy, and it's a fabulous book that we all refer to all the time. Pamela is not just an ornithologist. I look at her as a great investigative ornithologist, a Sherlock Holmes of the ornithological world, and she's been able to crack several mysteries over her career, especially the one with Dr. Zagan and his various shenanigans. Today, she speaks to us on on how she discovered the forest owlet. Please switch off your videos and keep yourselves on mute. Over to you, Pamela.
Thank you. All right. Thank you for being here today, or wherever here is for you. I hope everyone is keeping well. I know we're all hearing that a lot these days, but it is pretty important, obviously. So I hope things are going well for everyone, considering the circumstances. And today I'm going to be talking about something that some of you may have already heard a lot about. You may have even heard this talk that I gave, a version of it a few years ago, Chambal, at the bird fair, but I've modified it and I've added a few things. And basically I'm going to be talking today about the forest owlet, the research and other events that led up to its rediscovery. And happy to answer questions at the end. And please let me know if the power goes out or something happens, or if you can't hear me or I need to speak up or anything, just let me know. Let me see if I can. There's several things on my screen that are kind of in the way, and I'm just wondering if there's a way to move any of them.
It's fine, Pam. It's looking fine.
Okay.
It's fine.
All right. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Pam.
Okay. All right. So when I first started working on Indian birds in the early 1990s, when I was at the Smithsonian, believe it or not, that was so long ago now, but I kept hearing about the mystery birds of India. And like most birders, they really captured my attention, my interest, like the pink-headed duck, the very strange looking enigmatic bird that was last reported reliably in 1935, hasn't been seen since, despite numerous attempts. The Himalayan quail, a much more furtive species that could still be lurking somewhere in the northwestern Himalayas, but hope is fading because at least as far as I know, the last record was 1876. And the intermediate parakeet, which was actually shown by some of our research not to be a mystery bird at all, but to be a hybrid between the plum-headed parakeet and the slaty-headed parakeet. So this one, the mystery, did get solved in the 1990s. And the Jordan's courser, which was discovered in the mid 1800s and then pretty much lost to science, rediscovered spectacularly again in 1986, and despite that has become well, has gone to ground again. So as far as I know, we don't know the status of this bird at present. Perhaps somebody can correct me. That would be nice. So what about the other mystery bird, the forest owlet? The last specimen was claimed to have been collected in 1914 in Gujarat at Manvi. The last report in 1968 proved to be a misidentified photo of a spotted owlet. And a number of targeted searches at Manvi, where the last specimen was reportedly collected, at Melgat, at Sambalpur, and along the Tapti River, failed to find any in the 1970s. So sensibly, Ripley considered that it might be extinct, and upon reanalysis of all the specimens of the forest owlet that he could get a hold of, which was only a few, he found it to be very, very similar to the spotted owlet. And so his reconsideration, which involved the commissioning of this line drawing, showed it to be extraordinarily similar to the spotted owlet, and he considered that it might not even be field identifiable and might not even be a distinct species, as well as concluding that it was very likely extinct. Well, now we need to reconsider Meinertzagen's role in the forest owlet story. So I have to back up and tell you a few things about Meinertzagen. Richard Meinertzagen was a British ornithologist, adventurer. There are lots of titles one could give him. Colonel is one that he used a lot, and lots of stories attributed to him. But he also was very influential as an ornithologist, as an amateur ornithologist, I should mention, which is was the case for many of the ornithologists that were influential in Indian ornithology since its inception. And while I was in the early stages of preparing the South Asian guide, I happened to hear about a paper by Alan Knox published in the IBIS that claimed that Meinertzagen had stolen some redpoll specimens. These redpolls are finches from the Northern Hemisphere, and that the claim was that he had relabeled these specimens with fraudulent data, claiming to have collected them himself at a different place and time than the actual collection event. And so this fraud was alleged on the basis of a single species, and it hadn't been proved at that time, and there were still quite a few people actually doubting that and defending Meinertzagen stoutly because of this seeming slander. But it did raise questions, and I had realized at that time that Meinertzagen had quite a few specimens that were the sole reason that that several taxa were included in the Indian subcontinent. When I tallied them up based on the Ollie and Ripley handbook, there were 16 that were listed in the handbook as being in the subcontinent avifauna solely on his authority, based on his specimens in most cases. One was a site record. And these included notable birds such as the small snowfinch, which he claimed to have collected in Sikkim. It's a Mongolian species. Kessler's thrush, willow warbler, birds that otherwise had not been reported in the Indian subcontinent, and quite a few of them were subspecies, but distinctive ones. So my question was, what would we do, what should we do about whether we included these taxa or not? What should we have them, should we list them as part of the Indian subcontinent avifauna? Should we get them illustrated? And I didn't think we'd be able to ever really come to any kind of firm conclusions on that topic. But I went to the British Museum and started collaborating with Robert Priest-Jones, at the time the curator of the main curator of the bird collection there. And we got out all the 16 taxa that Meinertzagen had the sole specimens of for the Indian subcontinent. And we looked at them all together on a bench. And what we could see was that there were many different styles. There was not a single style, which suggested that it wasn't the work of a single person. Well, that's not too damning in of itself as a starting point, because he might have had quite a few people working for him preparing specimens. But then when we went back to the trays in the museum and started comparing, for example, his black-rumped magpie with those of other collectors, we saw they were virtually identical in some cases. We saw close matches, often with very unusual preparation styles or materials that were used, or both. For example, the magpie, not only was it flat like many of Mandeli's magpies, but it was stuffed with moss, which is an unusual stuffing material, just like some of Mandeli's magpies from Tibet. And so we found several close matches. And when we started looking in the register, because the Natural History Museum collections are not computer cataloged, we can only go back to the register to look to see whether specimens were originally entered into the collection. And we found in many cases, not all, but many, we found gaps where there was a specimen that matched the original collector's series. Often the number of gaps was the same as the number of specimens that Meinertzhagen claimed to have collected himself. And then we got X-rays done of the Meinertzhagen specimens and the other series that matched them. And we found strong corroboration in many cases. Many of the cases were more difficult and many remain unsolved, but we were able to convincingly show that quite a few of them were clearly fraudulent. And here's a few examples. So I'm not going to show you the specimens for them, but you can, I could, upon request, show you the images and X-rays of his specimens that he claimed to have collected in Ladakh of the gold crest of the Turkestan race Tristis and the bar-tailed tree creeper of the Turkestan race Tiniura. He claimed to have collected them as vagrants in Ladakh. And we can say for virtually certainly that they were actually from Turkestan based on the matches and the missing specimens. And a more obvious case, probably the most instructive case of all that we've found, that is very, very clear cut, involves the northern race of Lucas dictybranti, Palidior, and this is a pale-headed race, otherwise relatively similar to the common one of the high Himalayas. He claimed to have gotten 3 specimens of Palidior in Sikkim, along with the single specimen that he claimed to have collected of the small snowfinch, Montefringilla davidiana, now purgillata. And when we looked at the specimens, what we see is this obscured? Can somebody tell me? Or is it okay?
It's fine, Pam. It's fine. It's fine.
Good for me. All right. So Meinertzhagen's specimen, one of his specimens of the Brandt's mountain finch, matches very closely with a Ludlow specimen. Another specimen that Meinertzhagen claimed to have collected on the same day of the same taxon matches extremely closely with a Carruthers series. And the third of the 3 matches extremely closely with a Przewalski specimen. So Carruthers collected this series in Turkestan. Ludlow and Przewalski collected theirs at obviously separate times in Tibet. Meinertzhagen claimed to have these 3 collected all in the same day by himself. And as you can see, that cannot be the case. And there are register gaps for each of these. So this is a pretty much a cut and dried case of fraud, as many others are as well. So I finished up that initial work at the British Museum on Meinertzhagen and went back to work at the Smithsonian. I was sitting at my desk. Storrs Olsen came into the office and asked me a question about the Forest Owlet. That time I hadn't thought too much about the Forest Owlet, except I had wanted to go and search for it in central India in some vague unknown location. And I opened up the handbook and started reading. And it said, last collected in Gujarat in 1914. And then I read by Meinertzhagen, and I was like, uh-oh. And I started to wonder, well, since we now know that there are quite a few, an unknown number of frauds involving Indian birds in the Meinertzhagen collection, what about his Forest Owlet? And if it was fraudulent, where could he have gotten it from? At that time, I hadn't looked into how many specimens there were, but the literature tended to say vague things like there were less than a dozen specimens. So the number was vague, and I started to wonder, well, who collected them, where, and are there any that we don't know about? Could there be some hiding in museum collections? Could there be a lot of them even? And at that time, there wasn't the internet, at least not, excuse me, at least not ready availability of specimen records, and BHL didn't exist, et cetera. So we had to look in books and papers. And I started contacting museums, and pretty quickly found that there were 4 specimens. Well, we already knew about these 4 specimens at the British Museum. And I'm calling it the British Museum. It's actually the Natural History Museum. And these included the holotype, which is illustrated here. And that was collected in what was then called Bosna Fuljan, MP. And 2 specimens collected by James Davidson. I'm going to refer to him because we talked about him a lot as JD. And those were collected in northwest Maharashtra in the early 1880s in Talota Shahada area. And then the Meinertzagen specimen collected ostensibly in Gujarat in 1914, but we now suspected that that may not be accurate. And another specimen collected by Davidson, now in the collection of the MCZ, Museum of Comparative Zoology in Harvard. Another specimen collected by Davidson at the American Museum. And the final specimen that we knew about, collected by Valentine Ball in Karayal, formerly Orissa, and that was in 1877. So you can see the range of dates. 1882 was the late, or 3 was the latest, except for the Meinertzagen specimen. So just 7 known specimens. But at this time, we didn't know if there were others, again, hiding in collections. But we knew that we suspected the Meinertzagen specimen of being fraudulent. And we wanted to find out. So here's an X-ray of the Meinertzagen specimen. It's quite a nice looking specimen, externally clean and compact, well prepared. But when you look at it on X-ray, a few things start popping out. One is that there's not much bone left, and the skin is more extensive than the bone. The skin originally, well, it looks like the skin dried around something besides bone, and there's a very thick-looking neck and a bent wire, which is typical of mounted specimens or remade specimens, and pins holding the wings down. If you compare it with Davidson's specimens, well, they look very different. You see, Davidson had long-necked specimens. He had an unusual way of positioning things, leaving a lot of bone in the entire humerus and even the femur, which nobody else does, almost nobody. And also, I should say, wrapping the bones of the wing with cotton, which again, nobody else does. If you look at Blewitt's specimen, the type specimen, it's very neatly prepared with a different type of stuffing, and not the entire humerus, most of it, not the femur again, and just looks quite different. And then if you look at Ball's specimen, it's more compact and not as well prepared, again, looks quite different. So what we could say based on X-ray is that Meinertzagen specimen is not clearly in the preparation style of any other Blewitti specimens, because remember the other 2 that we knew about were also Davidson's, and they're very similar in style to his, the 2 shown here. And we could also say that we hadn't seen any other specimens in Meinertzagen's collection that looked much like this, because by that time we had X-rayed quite a lot of Meinertzagen specimens. None of them had those characteristics. So we were starting to wonder more and more, and we started looking in detail at the characteristics of the specimens. And I apologize for the quality of these images. They are from the publication. They're not particularly good, but what this one shows is the part of the incision of the Meinertzagen's Forest Owlet, and you can see a needle hole that once had thread going through it that no longer does. You can see ragged edges, disused skin edges. And then on this part of the incision, you see a nice clean cut where it's now sewn with new thread. And what this tells us is that because you can't have skin make a nice clean edge like this on a freshly prepared bird. It can only do that if you cut it after it's already dry. So this clearly shows that it had been re-stuffed. And on the neck, here's the eye and here's the neck. There's a sharp edge here where the skin was pushed together, and that had the effect of shortening the neck. And you can see that on the X-ray as well. And if you look at the X-ray of the wings, you see a lot of skin that's dried in a position that is quite improbable if this was the original preparation, because that skin was dried around a complete ulna and radius. And even here you can see where the humerus head was because of the position of this dried skin, but it's not there now. So most of the wing bone has been removed, but only after drying. So we now knew, without any question really, that Meinertz-Oggen's Forest Owlet specimen had been re-prepared. But that doesn't mean that it's stolen or fraudulent, because you can re-prepare a specimen anytime you want for any reason, just to make it look better or whatever. So it didn't necessarily indicate fraudulent, but bearing in mind what we already knew about Meinertz-Oggen, of course we suspected that. So we continued searching for a missing specimen. We knew about the 7, including Meinertz-Oggen's, but we thought that Meinertz-Oggen's had a different origin. So we were trying to find what that origin might be. We contacted museums, we visited them, we found nothing. Checked the literature, found nothing. And incidentally, I was checking when I was at the Natural History Museum next, I was checking the register there for a James Davidson specimen that I thought I might find for a whole different matter relating to the Meinertz-Oggen investigation. And Davidson specimens came in 2 different accessions. One was the Hume accession, which had a lot of Davidson specimens in them, and the other was his own accession, which was not listed taxonomically, unlike most collections. So I had to go through line by line in the register, and that was taking a lot of time, and I was getting impatient because I was running out of time. And I came across a listing as I was paging through for Carine Broma blewitti. It was misspelled, collected by Davidson in Toloda in 1844. And I thought, oh, that's one of the ones we already know about. And I turned the page. And then after that, I thought, wait, because don't all of Davidson's specimens come from the Hume collection? And that was when I realized that there was an additional Davidson specimen in his own register that had been registered in 1925, had not been listed as being removed, but had not been seen by the researchers working on the catalog of extinct and rare birds in the Natural History Museum, which came out in 1975, and was not seen by Ripley when he studied the Natural History Museum birds for his 1976 paper. So it went missing sometime between 1925 and the early 1970s. So we had a missing Davidson specimen, and we had a remade Meinertz-Oggen specimen. But how did we know whether they were the same bird? We could suspect that, but Meinertz-Oggen specimen had been so extensively remade that it seemed kind of impossible to tell. But fortunately, Davidson had a very unique preparation style. His specimens had long necks, which Meinertz-Oggen no longer did, but it had a folded neck. So you can see 3 layers of skin here, which if you add them all together, come out to be about like this. So Meinertz-Oggen's specimen had an artificially later shortened neck. Another peculiarity of Davidson's style was that he sewed the wings together over the back on the outside, and that there's what we call the wing string is hidden, usually hidden by the feathers. We could not find any other preparator in the region at that time who did that, but Meinertz-Oggen's specimen had the remnants of a clipped string positioned the same as the Davidson specimen. So it was clipped during the preparation, the re-preparation, I should say, almost certainly. It was still there. And another peculiarity I already mentioned was that Davidson wrapped the wing bones of his birds with cotton, which is a quite unnecessary step in preparing a bird, but he did it anyway. And he's one of the very few that would do that. And because the specimen had been re-prepared, we didn't think that we would find anything in an examination, but we thought we might find some cotton fibers on the inside of the specimen. So we were given permission to do to have the then collection manager at the Smithsonian do some forensic examination involving opening up one of the British Museum specimens again. And first thing he did, I thought we might find a stray fiber of cotton or so on the inside, but he made a cut on the inside of the wing that was didn't damage the specimen in any obvious way. And this is tow or wood fibers, which is what the bird was re-prepared with. This is the carpal joint, and this is the body would be over here. And so this is the outer end of the inner wing. And here at this outer end was a wad of cotton. And that cotton was yellow and was clearly original. And when we sent samples across the road to the FBI, the agent who normally worked on bird strikes with one of the other Smithsonian staff was able to confirm that it shared pretty much every characteristic with a specimen of cotton found in one of the other Davidson specimens collected within 2 days of the missing specimen. And we also found no evidence that Meinertzagen actually had gone to Mandvi in 1914. In fact, we examined his diary, and at that time, he was very busy. He had a lot of things going on. He didn't have time to make a train trip up to Mandvi. At that time, it would have taken quite a long time. And he also didn't collect any other specimens at Mandvi. And it seems odd that he would only collect a forest owlet there on a very quick trip that he didn't mention in his diary. And he also never published his blewitti. So we concluded, based on all this evidence, that the Meinertzagen specimen was in fact the missing Davidson specimen, and that there were no genuine specimens from Gujarat. And we published this in a paper in IBIS. So we now had come to the realization that there really were only 7 specimens, and that one of them had a different origin than it had been long believed to have. But that didn't answer the question of whether the Meinertzagen is a species. So we looked at whether, in fact, it was distinctive. Took the 4 usual measurements, wing, bill, tarsus, tail. They're pretty similar to spotted owlet, but I took a whole lot of other measurements as well, and those measurements showed differing proportions between forest and spotted owlets. So we also examined plumage characters and found that although one specimen, being very worn and poor plumage, kind of looked a little more like a spotted owlet than others, the other specimens were very distinctive and had characteristics that would clearly allow it to be readily field identifiable, including the bold markings on the flank, the white belly, the bold markings on the wing and tail, the lack of spotting on the mantle. So clearly it was distinctive, different. We also were able to confirm that with anatomical specimens. We had X-rays that we could measure the skeletal elements in. They also differ, the proportions differ, the skull is broader, etc. So we concluded that it was indeed a valid species. That didn't tell us, though, whether it was extinct. So we then were looking at the record of the forest owlet and trying to determine whether there was any reason to even try to find it again. So once we realized that there were only 4 genuine sites that had been collected in, 2 in Maharashtra and 2 in the east, when I looked at those sites, I realized they were all low elevation. The literature said they were in the hills, and one source even said in the mountains. So we realized that people had been thinking about this bird all wrong, where it might occur. And so I did museum searches, and among hundreds and hundreds of specimens of spotted owlet, found not a single additional forest owlet, nothing. And realized that few people had actually done any targeted searches. Now, a lot of people had been birding and doing ornithology in India, but not specifically looking for forest owlet, usually in different places. So what did we have to go on? I was thinking at this time, well, we don't have much of a shot at finding this bird, but I would like to go and see what the remaining habitat is like at these places where the bird has really been documented, and see whether maybe I could put together a proposal, work with some local collaborators, and and excuse me, and maybe make a serious attempt to find this bird. So put together what we knew, which was that Blewitt had obtained one near Kariyar, and that locality was less than 200 meters elevation. He said it was in dense forest. The one obtained by Ball near Basna, he said it was in a mango grove encountered during the day, and that's also low elevation. Davidson's 5 were, he didn't mention all of them, but the ones that he did, he specifically said they were found atop bare trees late morning. And we had no information in voice. And of course, voice is usually key to finding owls. So, so we didn't really know very much about this bird. We suspected, based on the fact that 2 of the collectors found their birds during the day, that it might be at least partly diurnal. And Nigel Collar and I published this paper. Well, we were nearly ready to publish it before the rediscovery, but this paper summarizes what we knew at that time. All right, then I had a plate painted by Larry McQueen, which I actually have in the background, the original plate of my house. And so Larry's plate shows the main differences between the spotted owlet and the forest owlet. And we were going to use a copy of that to query locals and ask if they had seen this bird. And I ended up teaming up with Ben King, who's a noted Asian owl expert, and a local birder named David Abbott. And we planned to search, over a 12-day period, planned to search all of the 4 known localities. But it was a cold case because these were the bird was last reported in 1883. And we started in the east because we thought that's where we had the best chance, lower human density and larger forest areas. We, with considerable trouble, got color copies of satellite images. Of course, this was long before Google Earth, and it was much more difficult to come across any information, and the satellite images that we got were kind of out of date, and they didn't provide much information, but we could see where the biggest forest patches should be. And we started visiting those forest patches as we could access them. We didn't know whether the bird was diurnal or not, so we were alternating between going out day and night and just tromping through, listening and looking. We didn't find anything, no sightings of anything unusual, no songs of any unknown owls, and nothing from locals that was helpful. And then we drove west. I was rather reluctant to leave these because I didn't think we had much of a chance in the west. And we got to the Shahada area. We went to the forest division and were told that by the deputy conservator that there wasn't any remaining low elevation forest in the area. And so that was pretty disheartening. But he then said, well, you might want to drive up into the hills, and then you can look down and see what I mean. There isn't any forest left there. So we thought, well, we might as well go into the hills, and we thought we'll do some owling. So we got up early. And I was also thinking, well, you know what? Most birds that are in the low elevations also get up into the hills to some extent. So maybe we still have a slight shot. Anyway, we were birding early in the mornings. We had a mottled owl that we got some photos of, and it was actually pretty productive. But then it was starting to get hot and sunny, and I was losing focus and getting thirsty. So I was opening my water bottle. Then Ben said very quietly, look at that owlet. And that's when I dropped my water bottle. And we looked at the owlet, and there it was, clearly a forest owlet. We had no doubt from the very moment that we laid eyes on it. It was sitting there in the open, in the bright sun, 8:30 in the morning. Ben had spotted it and realized that it was not something he had ever seen before. And the owl was looking at us, and we were thinking, wow, this bird has not been seen by ornithologists since 1884, but local people walk up and down that road all the time. The bus goes up and down now and then. The bird was used to people who didn't think there was anything special about us, probably. But I was terrified, frankly, that it was going to fly, and we were only going to be able to say, well, we saw a forest owlet, but we wouldn't be able to document it, because that's my usual luck, frankly. So it turned out, though, that was not the case. We had pretty primitive equipment, early video cameras that really, no image stabilization and not much of a zoom or anything, but the bird was cooperative, and we got pretty decent images considering. But we failed to get sound recordings, so we didn't even hear the bird. Ben was determined to get sound recordings. We tried and tried, didn't happen. Anyway, so then as I was leaving, I had a day in Mumbai and went to BNHS, and Dr. Ramani was director at the time. I told him of the rediscovery. He seemed to believe me, but Dr. Humayun Abdulali, who came into Ramani's office, said that he didn't think we could prove it because we hadn't collected a specimen. Well, of course we couldn't. We didn't have permits or anything, and that would be pretty impossible. But we had the evidence. So then when I returned to the Smithsonian, we prepared a press release, and this is the Washington Post article that came out about it, and there was a lot of coverage. Ben and I published a rediscovery in the Forktail, and then I came back a few months later to work with Farah Ishtiaq at the time at the BNHS, and we went to, because we hadn't made the location public, so we wanted to be sure that she could find the site to do her work. And so we found the site. The owlets were still there, and that was despite the fact that, in fact, there was already a lot of habitat disturbance, even at the original rediscovery site, just getting worse every day, basically. We also tried to search for the owlet elsewhere in the area and didn't find any at all. I was desperate to get sound recordings. I really believed that the forest owlet probably had a distinctive voice, but I had no evidence for that. And it had been speculated before that it sounded just like the spotted owlet, but again with no evidence. Anyway, we heard it early on, and I was so thrilled. But somehow I had my recorder on pause instead of actually recording, so I totally missed that opportunity, to my great chagrin. That was in my early days of sound recording, so these things tended to happen. But then I really needed to get that sound recording, so I just left the recorder on and would erase the blank recordings. So for days and days, I went around with my recorder recording, and at the end of the trip, finally got a sound recording, which is, here's a sonogram of that. Not the greatest recording, but it's a pretty amazing sound in my opinion. And that's part of the basis of this paper that Farah and I wrote. All right, well, later on, because we had elements removed from one of the specimens of the forest owlet, we were able to do a follow-up study to look at whether Hume's genus Heteroglaux that he had originally erected for blewitti was valid. And we found considerable differences, especially in the frontal bone, both on dorsal view and lateral view between forest owlet and spotted owlet, as well as major differences in the proportions of the leg, particularly the tarsometatarsus, which is much, much heavier and broader in the forest owlet than in the spotted. And that led us to support the original genus Heteroglaux, but subsequent DNA analysis have shown that it's nested within some of the other species currently considered to be members of Athene, but I personally still think that there's a case to be made for splitting up Athene into multiple genera. So that's something to be thinking about in the future. But anyway, I wanted to end the forest owlet portion of this, and then I have a few more things to cover after this. In looking at the situation now, these are just some of there's a couple first images that show up on a Google search, and it's obvious that the forest owlet is at least present in quite a few places now, especially with this eBird map shows the numerous locations where it's been reported, and that it is a very confiding bird out there in the middle of the day, and it still gets misidentified, of course, but mostly people know where to find it and how to identify it. And there's a lot of research ongoing about the forest owlet. These are just a few of the titles that have come out relatively recently. And it is very important that this research be allowed to proceed. Very important to be able to establish what the threatening factors are. And that often involves the need to identify individuals using a variety of safe methods. All right, now I want to just briefly, if I have time, yeah, it looks like I do, briefly touch on a few of the other semi-mysteries that I've come across along with my colleagues while working on Indian birds. And the first one of these are all 3 different new species that I worked on in the Indian subcontinent region. And the first one is the Nicobar scops owls, Otis alias. So this was known from 2 specimens that were at the BNHS that had been basically listed in the literature, but not given a name. And that was partly because of the fact that current understanding of the species limits of Otis magicus encompassed birds from the Seychelles right through to Biak Island of north of New Guinea. And so Otis alias, or it wasn't known as that then, but anyway, this great Nicobar bird, these 2 specimens were just, just another taxon in this group. And they hadn't really been studied thoroughly. So it wasn't recognized that they had distinctive characteristics. But when I studied them in the BNHS, I immediately recognized that there were some distinctive characteristics, but I had to study a whole lot of other taxa, all of the taxa, in fact, in detail in order to be able to make that case. And the main differences were the consistently barred upper parts, and to some extent lower parts as well, and the rather drab brown plumage, and some characteristics of the wingtip and the tarsus, etc. But it wasn't that distinctive, but it was as distinctive as many of the taxa that were considered, that have been considered species since anyway. But we didn't have any information on the voice. Nevertheless, I was able to publish it because I was convinced that it was a new species. And shortly after that, Indian herpetologists who had been to Great Nicobar sent me this photo, the first photos that I'm aware of this bird, which show its quite large feet and the barring and just the weak ear tufts, etc. And shortly after that, Pratap Singh was also in Great Nicobar, and he sent recordings of the first recordings of this bird, and I was quite thrilled by this because this helped to show that this bird's vocalizations are nothing like those of any of the Otis magicus group, which have a basically loud, gruff barking, single notes. And Otis alias actually has a voice much more like that of Otis umbra, the species from Simulu Island off northwest Sumatra. And that's actually makes a lot more sense because of the geographic proximity and some of the plumage characters and the structure of the wing as well. So that was the first one. And then shortly after that, I heard from Dipal Warkagoda in Sri Lanka that he had recordings of an owl, what he thought was an owl in Sinaraja that he had been hearing since 1995 but had never seen. And no one could identify it. And it was not very distinctive, just a little rather high-pitched hoot separated by many seconds. But to him, it was distinctive because he knew all of the sounds in Sri Lanka. So he didn't know what it was. He thought maybe I could help. And I started looking at specimens of the Sri Lankan owls to figure out if there might be a cryptic species mixed up in there somewhere. I found nothing at all. And then he went out with a photographer and got photos that show it to be very, very distinctive. And that ended up with us collaborating. He got one specimen, and we collaborated and published a paper about his discovery that I just helped with, the first new bird species in Sri Lanka in 130 years. And finally, I'll end with this one, the more recent one, new species, the Himalayan forest thrush, which was first noted as a very unusual set of circumstances where in Arunachal, birds singing, plainback thrushes singing above timberline had raspy, unpleasant, unmelodic voices with a lot of jittery and chittery and gruff notes, whereas those just below the timberline in the forest had beautiful, melodic, clear musical notes. This was in the same area in the breeding season, except different habitats, and the song types were very, very different. So Shashank and Pear noticed this, but they didn't have, they didn't know if there were plumage characters or structural characters that differed between them. And Pear asked if I might help because I was going to be at the British Museum. And there was also quite a few names that were in the literature that referred to the plainback thrush, and we needed to know which of those went with which taxon. If one was a new taxon, which one was new, because which one did the names go with. And I was pretty reluctant actually to get started on this because plainback thrushes are not easy to work with if you've ever tried. They're somewhat variable and it just very, very frustrating. But anyway, when I finally got around to it, it was quite a surprise to me because I could clearly see two categories. There were birds that were russet above versus birds that were olive above. If they were russet above, they had big bills, they had short tails, and they had short legs and short wings. And if they were olive above, they had small bills and long legs, long tails, long wings. And there turned out to be a lot more to it than that, but that was the basis for being able to separate them into two categories. And now we know other things like, for example, face pattern is typically different, leg color is quite different, some differences in the tail pattern, etc. And I have to say that not all birds are nearly as distinct as these, but they are reciprocally monophyletic. They're not particularly closely related. They've got very different songs. So we know they're different species. And they had been sitting in a large series in museums for, 150 years, and no one had thought to look at those particular characters to separate them out that way. And I wouldn't have, if it hadn't been for the very different songs that were noticed by Pear and Shashank. And we were able, fortunately, to name this after Dr. Salim Ali. So with that, I will end and want to thank all these people and institutions that have contributed to this study. There are many others that should be thanked as well. And thank you for joining this talk. And I'll look forward to your questions. Here is the question for you, though. So now I think we'll turn it over to Ashish.
That was a fascinating talk, Pam. And you made us realize that when you look for something, you really end up seeing what actually is there. As usual, we'll take up questions in a bit, Pam. Please be with us. And as in earlier talks, here is a question of the day that everybody is familiar with. The prizes that are being given by Zayas, binocular harness and cleaning kit. So the question is, after whom was the forest owlet named, and what do red poles and the forest owlet have in common? Kindly note down the URL link to which your answer has to be submitted. Now we open the discussion for questions. Kindly write your questions in the chat. So Pam, there is a question by somebody who asks whether the change in the genus from Heteroglaux to Ethini qualifies for a possible hybridization.
So it is possible for birds to hybridize whether they are closely related or not. There are lots of cases of intergeneric hybrids, and with DNA analysis, it is clear that hybridization is a lot more common than we ever realized based on analysis of external plumage. So hybridization happens quite a lot. The question is it rampant, and is it leading to a hybrid swarm? And that I do not believe to be the case.
Right. Umesh Mani wants to listen to the first recording of a forest owlet. Do you have one handy? Or?
Oh, I actually don't. I'm sorry, I couldn't get it to work.
So Zeno Cantu will perhaps provide.
I can certainly put it online later. In fact, I think it's on Avocet anyway, so I'd have to check. Sorry. No other questions?
No, there are. I'm just looking through the chat.
Oh, okay.
Do you believe?
There's one by Nitin Ashish. Yeah, that's the one. That's the one.
Yeah. Do you believe that first 3 missing birds, the pink-headed duck, the Himalayan quail, and the Jerdon's courser will be found? Jerdon's courser, of course, you've spoken about, but the other 2?
Well, I don't think the pink-headed duck will be, but who knows?
Yes.
And it's starting to not look so good for any of them, but
several people.
Unless there's recent information that I'm not aware of.
Mm-hmm. Saroj wants to know if there's a guidebook to study more about owlets, or particularly the forest owlet.
Well, there are a lot of recent publications, but I don't think there's anything that brings it all together. But there's some reports, unpublished reports, that may do so. I think probably some of the people who are currently working on the forest owlet would know better about this than I.
Right. Sumedh Jog wants to know whether the owlet is likely extinct in eastern India.
Well, that's very interesting because I don't know why it would be, but there don't seem to be any reports. So it seems that it should be there, and I don't know if there have been many recent searches, but you would think so. Does anybody know?
Farida Tampal wants to know that it was reported from the forests of Andhra Pradesh. Have you any reports, or did you look for them in these forests?
I'm not aware of any reports, and we did not search there.
There seem to be no more questions, Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Ashish, and thanks, Pam. Although I've heard this before twice, each time it's more fascinating, your whole journey of the forest owlet. It's really fascinating. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And do join us tomorrow for Dr. Pandya's talk on animal behavior. And on Sunday, we have Vivek Tiwari talking about his trip to the Andes, to the Amazon. Thank you all. Thank you, Pam, and thank you, Ashish. Have a good day.
Thank you, Nick.